The graveyard was unusually quiet, its silence broken only by the soft rustling of the wind. In the far corner, hidden under the shadow of an ancient oak, was the grave everyone in the village feared. At first glance, it looked ordinary, an old, weathered stone with faint carvings. But as night fell, it began to glow with a pale, eerie light. The villagers spoke in hushed whispers about it, claiming the glow was a curse. No one dared go near it, except for Ilara. Ilara stood at the edge of the graveyard, clutching a lantern in her trembling hands. Her heart raced, but her determination overpowered her fear. She had heard the stories like everyone else, but she couldn't ignore the strange pull the glowing grave had on her. It wasn't just curiosity, it was personal. Something deep inside told her that this grave held the answer to a question she had been too scared to ask for years. As she stepped closer, the glow seemed to shift, almost as if it were alive. The air grew colder, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Her lantern flickered, struggling to stay lit against the strange energy surrounding her. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper so soft it could have been the wind, but it wasn't. It was a voice, sad, pleading, almost human. Ilara hesitated, her mind screaming for her to run, but her feet refused to move. She knelt beside the grave, tracing her fingers over the faint carvings on the stone. Most of the words were illegible, worn away by time, but she managed to make out one word: forgive. The word sent a shiver through her. Who was asking for forgiveness, and why? The glow seemed to brighten, casting long, dancing shadows around her. She felt an overwhelming sadness, as if the grave itself carried the weight of a forgotten tragedy. Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that whoever lay here had a story that needed to be told, a story no one else wanted to uncover. Ilara spent the next day poring over old village records, desperate to uncover the identity of the person buried in the glowing grave. The villagers avoided her, their unease clear in their eyes. "You're digging into something best left alone," the old innkeeper warned her as she sipped her tea. His voice trembled as if the grave's secret weighed heavily on him. "That glow ain't natural. It's a warning." But Ilara wasn't convinced. If it was a warning, then why did it feel so sorrowful? It wasn't anger she felt near the grave, it was grief. Her search led her to the dusty archives of the village church, where forgotten records and fading letters waited in silence. It was there, buried among old marriage certificates and property deeds, that she found a peculiar mention of an unnamed grave. The record described a tragedy decades ago. A young woman, full of life, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Days later, her lifeless body was found at the edge of the woods, and the villagers had buried her quietly, unwilling to speak of what had happened. The document mentioned no family, no mourners, just a hurried burial and a faint inscription: "Forgive." Ilara's heart ached as she read the lines. Who was this woman? Why was her death cloaked in silence? She couldn't help but notice the date. It matched the stories of a terrible storm that had once ravaged the village. Many believed the storm was an omen, but Ilara wondered if it was something more, a cosmic sign of the injustice that had unfolded. That night, she returned to the graveyard, the weight of her discovery heavy on her chest. The glow was brighter than ever, casting a soft white light over the surrounding tombstones. As she knelt by the grave again, she pulled out the record she had found. "I know you were wronged," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But I don't know how to help you yet." The moment the words left her lips, the air shifted. The whispering returned, louder this time, though still faint, like the sound of leaves brushing against each other. "Find the truth," it seemed to say. Ilara's eyes widened. She wasn't imagining it. The grave was speaking to her. But what truth? And who was hiding it? Ilara couldn't sleep that night. The whispering from the grave echoed in her mind, each word fueling her determination. The next morning she decided to speak to the oldest resident in the village, a reclusive woman named Marta, who rarely left her house. Marta's piercing eyes seemed to see through Ilara the moment she knocked on the creaky wooden door. "You've been to the grave, haven't you?" Marta said before Ilara could speak. Her voice was hoarse but carried a weight of knowing. Ilara nodded, her throat dry. Marta sighed heavily and gestured for her to come inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with old books, dried herbs, and faded photographs. "Her name was Lyra," Marta began, her voice trembling with age and sorrow. "She was my best friend, and she didn't deserve what happened to her." Ilara leaned forward, hanging on to every word. Marta explained how Lyra had been a healer, someone the village once adored. But jealousy and fear turned admiration into hatred. A false accusation of witchcraft spread like wildfire, and the villagers, driven by fear, had turned against her. "They dragged her to the edge of the woods during the storm," Marta whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen. They left her there to die, alone and terrified. When they found her body, the guilt was too much for them to bear. So they buried her in silence, hoping time would erase their shame." Ilara felt a lump in her throat. The glow wasn't just grief. It was Lyra's pain, her cry for justice. "Why didn't anyone speak up?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Marta looked away, her hands trembling. "Because we were cowards," she admitted. "And now, her spirit can't rest." Ilara knew she couldn't stop now. If Lyra had been wronged, then her story needed to be told. "What can I do to help her?" she asked. Marta hesitated, then reached for a small, leather-bound journal. "This was Lyra's," she said, placing it in Ilara's hands. "She wrote about her dreams, her fears, and the people who betrayed her. Maybe it will guide you." That night, Ilara sat by the grave, the journal open in her lap. She read Lyra's words, each page pulling her deeper into the healer's life. Lyra had been kind, compassionate, and deeply misunderstood. The final entry made Ilara's hands tremble. "If they come for me, I forgive them. But I hope one day someone will remember who I really was." The whispering grew louder, as if Lyra's spirit could feel her story being told. For the first time, Ilara felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she could be the one to bring peace to the restless soul. But how could she convince a village to confront the sins of their past? Ilara spent the next day grappling with the weight of Lyra's story. She knew the villagers wouldn't be easy to convince, but she also knew she couldn't ignore the truth. Armed with Lyra's journal, she decided to speak at the town square, a place where voices echoed and secrets found their way into the open. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in a soft golden light, Ilara stood in the center of the square. Villagers gathered reluctantly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and fear. The glowing grave had always been a source of unease, and many whispered about Ilara's recent visits. Holding Lyra's journal tightly, Ilara began to speak. She shared the healer's story, her kindness, her innocence, and the cruel betrayal that led to her death. She read passages from the journal aloud, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Each word painted a vivid picture of a woman who had been stripped of her dignity and left to die because of fear and ignorance. Some villagers averted their eyes, their guilt surfacing as Ilara recounted the stormy night Lyra was abandoned. Others murmured in disbelief, clutching their children as if shielding them from the truth. "You all know this grave," Ilara said, her voice rising. "You've seen its light, felt its presence. Lyra is still here, waiting for someone to acknowledge what happened to her. She doesn't seek revenge, she seeks justice." An elderly man in the crowd stepped forward, his face pale and his hands trembling. "I was there," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I was young and scared, but I didn't stop them. I, I've carried that guilt my entire life." His confession broke the silence, and soon others joined in, their voices quivering as they admitted their roles in Lyra's tragic end. Tears streamed down Ilara's face as she realized the villagers were finally confronting their past. But the question remained, what could they do to bring Lyra peace? The glow from the grave was brighter than ever that night, almost as if Lyra was listening, waiting for the final act of redemption. Ilara turned to the villagers, her voice resolute. "We must honor her, not just by admitting the truth, but by showing her the respect she deserved in life. Let us gather at her grave and offer her the apology she never received." The crowd murmured in agreement, their shame transforming into a collective determination. As the villagers dispersed to prepare for the ceremony, Ilara stayed behind, staring at the glowing horizon where Lyra's grave waited. She felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation, knowing the final chapter of this painful story was about to unfold. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra's forgiveness might not come easily. The scars of betrayal ran deep, and the glow, though steady, still carried an undercurrent of sorrow. The night of the ceremony arrived, and the entire village gathered at the graveyard. The glowing grave illuminated the somber faces of the villagers, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to mirror the weight of their guilt. Ilara stood at the forefront, Lyra's journal clutched in her trembling hands. A hush fell over the crowd as she began to read Lyra's final words once more, her voice carrying through the still night air. "I forgive them," Ilara recited, her voice soft but resolute. "But I hope one day someone will remember who I really was." The villagers bowed their heads, some sobbing openly as the magnitude of their actions sank in. The elderly man who had confessed earlier stepped forward, holding a bouquet of white lilies. He knelt at the grave, placing the flowers gently on the glowing surface. "Lyra," he said, his voice trembling, "I'm sorry. We were wrong, and you deserved better." One by one, the villagers followed, each offering their apologies, their grief pouring out like a dam finally breaking. Some whispered prayers, others simply touched the earth above Lyra's resting place as if seeking her forgiveness. Ilara stood back, watching as the collective remorse of the village filled the air with a palpable sense of healing. As the last villager stepped away, the glow of the grave began to shift. The light grew warmer, softer, as though Lyra's spirit was responding to the outpouring of emotion. Suddenly, a faint figure appeared above the grave, a shimmering outline of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they realized it was Lyra's spirit. Her voice was barely audible, a soft echo carried by the wind. "Thank you," she said, her gaze sweeping across the villagers. "I can rest now." The glow intensified one last time, enveloping the grave in a radiant light before fading into the night. The graveyard fell silent, the once constant glow replaced by a peaceful stillness. The villagers lingered, unable to leave the spot where Lyra had finally found peace. Ilara, overcome with emotion, placed Lyra's journal on the grave as a final tribute. "Your story won't be forgotten," she whispered. "We'll remember who you were." The villagers left the graveyard in silence, their hearts heavy, yet lighter than before. The fear and unease that had hung over the glowing grave were gone, replaced by a sense of closure. Ilara stayed a moment longer, her eyes fixed on the now dark grave. She knew she had done the right thing, but a question lingered in her mind. How many other stories like Lyra's lay buried, waiting for someone to uncover the truth? As she turned to leave, a single firefly appeared, its gentle light dancing in the air above the grave. It was as if Lyra's spirit had left behind a small reminder that even in the darkest times, forgiveness and truth could bring light. Days after the ceremony, the village began to change. The once divided community started to come together, their shared guilt now replaced with a commitment to honor Lyra's memory. The glowing grave had left a mark on their hearts, a reminder of how fear and prejudice could destroy lives. They decided to build a small garden around Lyra's grave, planting flowers that symbolized peace and remembrance. Ilara became a central figure in the village, her courage to uncover the truth inspiring others to face their own pasts. Many approached her, sharing stories of their ancestors and other forgotten tragedies. She listened patiently, recording their tales with the same care she had given Lyra's story. She realized that uncovering the truth didn't just heal the dead, it healed the living too. One evening, as Ilara walked through the now blooming garden, she noticed something strange. A faint glow had returned to Lyra's grave, but this time it wasn't unsettling. It was soft and gentle like the light of a distant star. It didn't pulse with sorrow or anger, but seemed to radiate gratitude and peace. The firefly from that night reappeared, circling the grave before landing on Ilara's shoulder. She smiled, feeling a warmth she couldn't explain. "You're still here," she whispered, as though speaking to Lyra. "But it's different now. You're free." As the seasons passed, Lyra's grave became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking forgiveness and redemption. The village, once known for its silence and secrets, transformed into a beacon of healing and storytelling. Ilara continued her work, ensuring that no story, no matter how painful, would ever be forgotten again. And though the glow of Lyra's grave would occasionally return, it was no longer a reminder of sorrow but a symbol of hope. It was as if Lyra herself had chosen to remain, not out of unrest but as a quiet guardian of truth, watching over a village that had finally learned to embrace its humanity. The firefly, too, became a symbol of Lyra's enduring presence. On clear nights, its tiny light could be seen hovering above the garden, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest of times, the truth could set both the living and the dead free.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.